On March 26, 2019, when this podcast was very, very young, Google's front page art, aka Google Doodle, was a woman sitting among desert dunes writing a book. It was Sanmao. Who was she? Well, in this episode we have Sanmao translator and indeed Sanmao expert and most importantly Sanmao admirer, Mike Fu, here to help answer that question. My discussion with him covered a lot of ground. You're going to hear mention of our word of the day and of lots of ION words: elation and depression, appreciation and accusation, colonialism and liberation, culture crossing and culture clashing, Aileen Chang, J.G. Ballard, Rudyard Kipling, Philip K. Dick, books as devices for transmission and time travel, because I really just can't get my head out of the sci-fi zone, even though this isn't a sci-fi book. But before all of that stuff, let's hear the news. Not just any news, the TrChFic news. So our first news item is about me. It's my news, but it is interesting and it could lead to cool stuff on this show. It's another event I'm going to, hosted by the Leeds Centre for New Chinese Writing. If you've been listening to the show for even a brief stretch of time, you'll have heard me talk about it before. Well, they're doing an event for book reviewers in late March, and I'm going to go along to that. We're going to be discussing various C2E books in kind of like workshop format. It should be very exciting. I'm hoping to find some possible new show guests whilst I'm down there, so expect to hear a wee bit more about that in the future. Watch this space. I know for a fact one of the books we're going to talk about is The Perfect Crime by IE, which I've covered on the show. A Hero Born, the first in the Legends of the Condor Heroes series. I've read that, we've not covered that on the show. And the other book, one that I do actually have to read in preparation, is That We May Live, which is actually my second news item. I'm going to tell you about what That We May Live is. So That We May Live is coming out from Two Lines Press, who publish translated works, basically. And rather than me trying to briefly summarise what this book is and then reading other people's descriptions, I'm going to start with the kind of, the blurb for the book that Two Lines Press have got up on their site. So here we go. A woman impulsively decides to visit her grandmother, in a scene reminiscent of Little Red Riding Hood, only to find herself in a town of women obsessed with a mysterious fermented beverage. An aging and well-respected female newscaster at a provincial TV station finds herself caught up in an illicit affair with her boss, who insists that she recite the news while they have sex. An anonymous city prone to vanishing storefronts begins to plant giant mushrooms for its citizens to live in, with disastrous consequences. In this first book in the brand new Calico series, we, that being Two Lines Press, bring you work by some of today's most exciting writers from China and Hong Kong, including Dorothy Tse, Zhu Hui, and Enoch Tam. Lightly touching on issues of urbanization, sexuality, and propaganda, the collection builds a world both utterly disorienting and disturbingly familiar, prompting the question, where does reality end and its absurdity begin in a world pushed to its very limits? So they've been kind of pushing it or presenting it as a collection of Chinese speculative fiction. That's a bit of I don't know if loaded or contentious is the right term, but it's supposed to be a term that covers sci-fi, fantasy and horror, but one, puts them under an umbrella, and two, gives it a kind of literary, I don't know if prestige is the right word, but it puts it in a literary sort of mode or space to put it alongside supposed highbrow literature. But the thing I'm noticing about this collection is it's kind of a world apart from the world of Chinese sci-fi, kind of, and translated Chinese sci-fi as well, which kind of is probably gathered around, I suppose, Liu Cixin and Thor, Head of Zeus, and Clark's world. This is a different kind of genre fiction, if you can call it that, coming, I would say, from like a more literary angle. If you've ever come across the term magical realism, which is also a kind of fiction that plays with reality but keeps its kind of literary prestige. I wonder if this might be more like a magical realist series, but they're putting it under speculative fiction for their own marketing reasons. That's my slightly cynical take, but I have a PDF copy of this book, and I have to say it looks absolutely marvellous. They've got like really nice pages for the authors, like mini author bios that are bilingual. They have the Chinese and the English side by side on those author bio pages. So as a piece of design, it's gorgeous. They've got a full list of the authors who are appearing. There's Dorothy Ce, Enoch Tam, Zhu Hui, Chan Chiwa, Chen Se-an, who we covered on the show before. She wrote the play I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe, Ocean Hot Pot, and Yan Ge, who obviously we covered. I've talked about her book Chili Bean Paste Clan with Nikki Harman in a past episode, and the list of translators. So as we said, there's Natasha Bruce and Jeremy Tiang. Jeremy Tiang we've mentioned a few times. There's also Kanan Morse, Audrey. I do not know how to say that surname. Audrey Hagens, probably Haynes, not sure, and Michael Day as well. So it's been a bit of a long news entry, but there you go. Everything you need to know about That We May Live. Keep your eyes open for that one and expect me to talk about it more on the show. Okay, third news item, and the last one. I think I've tweeted about this, and it's about Paper Republic, who I think you've heard about on just about every episode for the last wee while. So Paper Republic is basically the best database of translated Chinese fiction, or maybe even definitely also the best English language database and hub point for English language hub point about Chinese literature. It's a fantastic site run by some really great translators and whatnot. So they're looking for people to help add to, add to and amend stuff in their database, because although they are the best database of this stuff, it isn't quite complete. There's like, when I go on there a lot to get authors' names and information, pictures, histories of publication, and it is an absolute lifeline for me, but it's not complete. So I've signed up as a contributor, and I've added a few things. It's a pretty easy system once you've got your head around it. So if you have the time and you're interested, just go head over to their website, and you should find the necessary information to sign up as a contributor. It's lovely people that run it, Eric Abrahamson and Nikki Harman, and I believe there's a couple other translators. It's top stuff. Just even if you don't want to help them out, just check out their site, because if you like this podcast, you will find their site to be a treasure trove. So yeah, that is all the news. Let's crack on, and let's hear from Mike Fu and what he had to say about Sanmao's Stories of the Sahara. So I've got on the show with me Mike Fu. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Angus. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I had a very nice day, and I'm having a very nice evening. So Mike is the translator of the Sanmao book that we're looking at today, and he's an incredibly friendly, and in my opinion, from what I've gathered and from reading his translation, a very sharp person. And I can add, if you know what this means, he's got an olive tree artfully placed with Chinese and emojis, my two favorite languages, on his Twitter bio. So shameless flattery aside, Mike, can you tell us a wee bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So, hello, everyone. My name is Mike. I have been a resident of New York City for the past almost 12 years now. And by day, I'm a university administrator working at Parsons School of Design. But I'm also a Chinese English translator and a writer of primarily fiction. And my recent translation of Stories of the Sahara by Sanmao was published by Bloomsbury in November 2019 in the UK and released worldwide in January 2020.
And for any of you guys who are, well, I suppose most of the listeners can't be big publishing nerds, Bloomsbury, if that's ringing a bell, that's the company that got its big start from publishing Harry Potter and now publishes, not that Harry Potter isn't cool, but lots of cool things, just like Sanmao's book. I think you're at least the second New Yorker who's been a guest on the show. We had another translator, Matt Turner, who was on as well.
Oh yes, I know Matt. That's great.
Cool. Yeah, he did the first ever episode that was kind of an author being covered for a second time. He did the version of Lu Xun's Wild Grass Ye Cao, which he'd called Weeds. So yeah, we did Lu Xun and Weeds.
copy of that a couple months ago. I saw him, do a reading at China Institute here in New York.
Oh, cool. I have an e-copy. They weren't able to give me a physical one, but it's a pretty book. And so if you guys are interested, seek out Weeds by Lu Xun, translated by Matt Turner. Anyway, let's try not to get derailed before we even finish the intro. Mike, there's a lot of things I'd love to ask you about Stories of Sahara, but let's take one small step before we take the other 999. I haven't remembered to do a word of the day for every single episode since I introduced the concept of the show, but we've got one for today, and apologies if I mess up the tones. Liu Lang. So I've got a trio of questions themed around this word, Liu Lang, that might help listeners who are new to Sanmao, and even listeners who know Sanmao but don't know so much about the Sahara. So first of these three Liu Lang questions, what does Liu Lang mean? And also, am I messing up the tones horribly?
It's Liu Lang.
Liu Lang, okay.
It means to roam or to drift, to wander. Any of those sort of very loosey, abstract kind of notions of rootlessness, essentially. The characters are Liu, as in flow, to flow, and is like waves, essentially, among other constructions that you can find both of those characters in. But yeah, essentially means to be a drifter, a vagabond, that sort of thing.
Leo has come up so many times on this podcast. I think we've had Liu Lang before. We've had Liu Mang come up a few times, and I don't know if I've explicitly talked about it on the show, but I've run into Liu Wang, just like emigre or exile. And spoilers for upcoming episodes, if all goes according to plan, I'll be doing one with a very special guest on Vagabonds by Hao Jingfang, and its Chinese name, I'm stupid and I've forgotten characters 3 and 4, but the first two are also Liu Lang. So I don't know if this is my own little personal tastes making me zoom in on this thing, or if this really is a big character in Chinese literature, the Liu part. Is it something that jumps out at you a lot, or is this just all kind of...
I feel like I haven't quite noticed its recurrence so much, but it is a fairly common character, I'd say.
Right.
So, maybe once you start to become aware of a particular thing, you start seeing its pattern everywhere.
What's that? What is that bias called? Is that selection bias or something?
Not sure about that.
Some kind of bias. It'll come to me. Okay, so that was the first question. Second question's maybe more straightforward. Who was Sanmao?
Sanmao was the pen name of, there are two characters, right, or two distinct iterations of Sanmao. The earlier one being a cartoon character popularized by a Shanghainese cartoonist by the name of Zhang Leping in the 1930s and 40s primarily. Sanmao, literally 3 hairs, was a street urchin in Shanghai, and a political cartoon of the time, essentially. He was so malnourished that he had only 3 hairs on his head. Later on, the name Sanmao was also adopted by a Taiwanese woman who traveled to Western Africa in the 1970s, and she took on this moniker as her pen name and started writing some interesting dispatches while living in the Spanish Sahara, sending them back home to be printed in the newspapers in Taiwan. And eventually, when those collected stories were published as a single volume, Stories of the Sahara, that was her entree into the literary scene more formally. And for the rest of her life, she was known as Sanmao.
Mm-hmm. And we could probably get more into the philosophical question of who or what is the concept or the persona of Sanmao later on. But rather than get bogged down in that, a third question here that ties 1 and 2 together. What have Liu Lang and Sanmao got to do with each other?
Well, firstly, I think she, as a person, she was very much someone who engaged in the act of Liu Lang, let's say, drifting around the world. So she was born in Chongqing in the early 40s, actually, during the Chinese Civil War, and then relocated with her family to Taiwan in the late 40s, where she came of age. And in the 60s, she found herself, her name is Chen Ping,
Right.
and eventually just Chen Ping when the middle character Mao was dropped from her given name.
Hmm.
But as a young woman, Chen Ping traveled to Europe, studied abroad in Spain and Germany, or West Germany at the time, and the United States, and then eventually went back to Taiwan, then returned to Spain again, went to Africa, wrote the stories that became Stories of the Sahara. And throughout her life, really was kind of this wandering character. So Liu Lang, in that sense, seems most apropos for the trajectory of her life. But also, it's really connected to the popular memory of Sanmao through the song that she wrote
Right.
called "The Olive Tree," and the refrain is speaks a lot about drifting far away, roaming far away, or asking herself, asking the listener, why do I roam so far away?
Mm. As prep for the show, I think this might get mentioned later on in my notes. If we mention it now, we might not mention it later. But in any case, as prep for the show, I listened to a recording of the Olive Tree song, and it struck me it was quite a sad, reflective song.
Yeah.
And the Stories of the Sahara, it's definitely reflective, but sadness. Nah, there are moments that are not, I don't know, that aren't bubbly and uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Upbeat, I suppose. But there's not really a lot of sadness in the Stories of the Sahara. And just before you called me, I was watching a film we might talk about later called English name's Red Dust, which was a script. The script of Red Dust was written by Sanmao. And there's a lot of sad. Well, I'm only about a third of the way through it, but already I can see there is a sad undercurrent in that. So did you see the same thing I see reading Stories of the Sahara, that the sadness you can see in San Mao's other output isn't really there?
Interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of levity in Stories of the Sahara, but
Mm,
there's just as much darker content or themes that comes through pretty regularly. And I wouldn't say the book on the whole is a sad book, but I think knowing what we know in hindsight about both Sanmao and her late husband, Jose, I think there is maybe that sort of, maybe it's my own or the reader's own projected, sadness in some cases.
mm.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think sadness is really the at the forefront, but at the same time, I feel like it's something that is, for me at least, a little bit somewhat unshakable from there's a tinge of it in even some of the happier stories.
Yeah, for sure. For listeners who don't know, when you mentioned about the things some readers will know in the back of their head about San Mao and her husband Jose, what are those things? Just for anyone who doesn't know.
Well, Sanmao, she and her husband, her Spanish husband Jose, were living in the Western Sahara, the Spanish Sahara, the last colony of the Spanish Empire, in the
Mm,
mid 70s, and that's the time during which she wrote this book, or the stories that became this book. And then they relocated to the Canary Islands afterward, and Jose ended up dying in a diving accident in 1979, I believe also in the Canary Islands. And then Sanmao eventually took her own life about 12 years later in 1991.
right. A year after Red Dust came out. I have to say, the way Jose passed away in an accident, there's certainly a lot of close shaves that I guess both the characters have in this book. They certainly lived an adventurous life when they were out in that part of the world. I'd like to ask a question about that, but I've got a lot of questions for you, and we should charge on. We've got a few different sections. There's publishing questions, questions about the author, questions about the story, questions about the translation of the story, i.e., your work, and then some questions about the further reading that we've kind of touched on already. So let's start. Let's go through the sequence I've got them in. Let's start with the publishing angle, which I'm interested in as a person who holds a master's in publishing that he's putting to some kind of use. Let's talk about that stuff. So first question here. When I was doing some like initial research slash snooping around for this episode, I was kind of surprised to see such a big disparity between the celebration of San Mao that you can find in English and that I had heard a lot from lots of Chinese friends, and that you can find, I think, in Chinese if you know how to find it. And the publication in translation, the English language things, I guess the English language output of Sanmao is not easily accessible, at least as far as I could find. You can read about her, but to get her actual words, until now, thanks to you and Bloomsbury, I guess, wasn't so easy. You've kind of remedied the drought, as it were. So is everything I've just babbled on about there, my impression, is that correct?
As far as I know, yes, there have been some unofficial translations of her work floating around the internet.
Ah,
Some things that I'd seen, over the years that I've been doing this project. But I don't believe there was any official published English translation of her work until now. And it's quite startling given her influence in the Chinese-speaking world and the fact that this book came out in 1976 originally. So
right.
it's a gap of nearly 50 years between its original publication and the translation into English.
Yeah. I don't remember if I wrote an explicit question about this, but what has her influence been? I mean, I know it's big. People have told me it's big, but you might be a great person to lay out exactly why she's such a big deal.
Well, I think she was in her generation, the 70s and 80s, when she kind of emerged onto the literary and cultural scene. Um, People were fascinated by her, and many young people, especially young women, um, were drawn to her voice, her literary voice, as well as her kind of transnational sensibilities, let's say,
Mm,
her globetrotting ways, her effortless polyglot status, many things like that. I think at a time when young people from Taiwan and Hong Kong, let alone mainland China, really did not have the means to travel so far and wide, she was one of the first figures, and especially a female, a young woman who was able to not only roam to Europe and Africa and Latin America and what have you, but also to really participate and to be part of those cultures to an extent. She spoke fluent English and Spanish, and I think also a bit of German. She was just like a very charismatic figure in the public eye and in the way that she presents herself in her stories.
It just occurred to me, like you said, people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, mainland China weren't able to travel the world, maybe partly because of just, well, I guess in China and Taiwan, I'm not sure, I'm not as educated about Hong Kong, but there were authoritarian regimes in place, but also just, I guess, worldwide technologically, it wasn't as easy to be a globetrotter as it is now. I've heard people say that in a way she's a kind of a proto embodiment of like your modern blogger, travel blogger, or maybe even travel Instagrammer or something.
Some ways, yes, I've heard that comparison as well.
Do you think it's a good one, or do you think it's a bit superficial?
I think it's not necessarily, well, I think it's accurate in that it's a double-edged sword, right? And I think that's why her detractors also, had their comments about the type of persona that she projected. So she was very
Right.
influential because many people were like, wow, who's this amazing, like multilingual, woman who's out there living abroad, writing about her life and sort of very confessional in some ways and oversharing, relatable. Those are kind of the words that get tossed about. And then I think, people who view her work negatively or don't have, let's say, they don't have high praise for her literary merits think that a lot of the content that she produced, or let's not say content, that's too contemporary. Lots of
Yeah, exactly.
the stories that she wrote, the books that she wrote, were self-absorbed and superficial in that same vein.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of that in good measure, written well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a criticism if it's personal, but I can see where those critics might have been coming from. I don't agree with them, but I kind of get it. I'm really my tendency to waffle and go on a tangent is really showing here. But another thing that occurred to me, I was trying to think like what, from my own perspective here, living in the UK, what British writers were famous for writing things living further afield, and the answer is, of course, maybe people like Rudyard Kipling, who were far afield and on the ground, but because of the empire. Whereas in this book, Sanmao, she's not part of a Taiwanese imperial project, but she's living in a place where, like you said, some kind of empire or colonialism or whatever is still going on. I don't really have a question here.
Yeah.
I think that's just a little interesting note to drop when we start to talk about that stuff. Let's go back to publishing really quickly. So how do Crown Publishing and Bloomsbury fit into the kind of, I don't know what you call it, fit into the scene of Sanmao being brought into English in translation?
Crown was her original publisher in Taiwan that released Stories of the Sahara in the 70s. And
Right.
I believe she had a relationship with one of the editors there prior to its publication, or she knew one of them, was close to somebody. I think that they were her exclusive publisher for the remainder of her life, in Taiwan at least. And Bloomsbury acquired the rights to this book in 2015. And then sometime in early 2016 was when I was hired for the project.
Well, it's interesting that the rights were acquired that many years back and now it's come to fruition, but it goes to show how little I know about rights in publishing, despite having a master's. But we'll skip over my ignorance and go to the next question. So my research, I can admit, it's been a little bit lazy. Like, I didn't know Crown Publishing was Taiwanese. I saw that very kind of European medieval looking name, Crown, and I assumed this was some other Western publisher. But anyway, that's an indication of how maybe laid back I've been. Another indication is that to just find out some things from more knowledgeable people, I made a Sanmao group chat on Instagram because I saw that Instagram has enabled such things. And I learned some really interesting things from my listeners. Thank you, guys. Dylan Levi King and Scarlett Zhang, especially. Thanks, guys. They told me that there used to be a lot of, not just like an economy of books by Sanmao, but I suppose secondary texts. There was an economy of books about Sanmao that Chinese and Taiwanese publishers could make a little bit of money off. Have you come across, or had you come across those at all?
Yeah, so she definitely stirred up a lot of vigorous opinion, I think, of various kinds. So she was prolific in her own writing and publications. Like I think she had over 20 titles to her name. And then I want to say mostly after her passing, but maybe there were some before. There were a number of books written by others about Sanmao, her own kind of like biographical accounts, but there were also other more scandalous publications that were, like by her contemporaries, who, like a contemporary male author or writer who set out to debunk Sanmao's claims. They would go try to retrace her footsteps in Western Africa and claim that a lot of the things that she wrote about in her stories that were purportedly autobiographical, or at least semi-autobiographical, people were claiming that she had, invented outright, or fabricated large swaths of what she passed off in public as her own experiences.
Sounds a bit mean-spirited of those authors.
Oh yeah, to say the least. And there's still many people who are diehard fans of Sanmao in the present day, and there are a couple of names among those writers that are completely persona non grata, let's say.
Well, serves them right. Speaking of this group chat that I mentioned, one listener told me a tale, and this relates to maybe posthumous output, let's say, not posthumous publications, but output after leaving this world, let's say. One listener in the group chat told me about playing a game of sorry if I mess up these tones again, Bixian, pen, something like pen fairy is the literal translation. It's a little bit like a Chinese Ouija board. Have you heard of Bixian before?
Bixian.
Bixian.
I haven't. I don't know if I'm familiar with that. No, but I've heard some story related to this. I don't know if it's the same one, where she
Okay.
said about somehow trying to contact her dead husband.
He that I hadn't heard about that. This listener's story was that as a younger girl or woman, her and her friend played Bixian to try and commune with Jose, her dead husband. So I was going to ask you if you've heard of that level of fandom, but what you've revealed is there's a story of Sanmao doing it herself. So I guess another evidence of the influence she's had on her fans. I don't really have any more questions about that. It's too interesting not to mention. Another publishing question. It's about the paratexts, so the elements in the book that aren't Sanmao's writing, that aren't the main body. There's a lot in this edition. I think I made a list here. There's a foreword by another writer. There's a timeline of Sanmao's life. There's a translator's note by yourself. There's end matter footnotes. There's translator's acknowledgements, obviously by yourself. There's a note on the author, Sanmao. There's a note on the translator, that's you. And then there's even a whole page dedicated to the font that was used. That's a pretty hefty contribution for kind of the metatextual elements, a whole book on the font. But for me, it kind of worked because it gave not just kind of adding value, to use a soulless capitalist business term, but it added like a sense of literariness or importance or bookishness or whatever you want to call it to the book. Do you think that was the intention, or was it maybe just more to package and introduce Sanmao to Western readers?
Both, but maybe the latter.
Right.
So I was really happy that Charlene Teo was able to write the foreword and really give that overview of the content of the book, and then the biographical details that you mentioned, that was actually, or the milestones, in the life of Sanmao, that was actually a direct translation of pages that appeared in the last edition of Stories of the Sahara that was released
right.
in 2011.
So like inherited content, or whatever the technical term is.
Yeah. Note on the type, I don't know. I guess Bloomsbury thought that was something that was important to mention, but I'm happy it's in there, and I'm glad to hear that the other notes were somewhat interesting or useful. I feel like it, perhaps in retrospect, it feels a bit indulgent to have written both like an explanatory or a couple of pages and also an acknowledgement section. But I'm happy that I had the opportunity to really, overshare, as is my tendency to when it comes to things like this.
Personally, like I'm in films and books, I quite like meta things, and I remember long before I knew I was going to venture and live in China or anything like that, or do this podcast or be interested in translation. I read, it's the book that what's it? The Roman Polanski film, The Ninth Gate. That's based on a book called The Club Dumas, and that was the first book I ever read where it mentioned that it was written in translation. And I remember liking the prose in the book, and I remember having this like self-consciousness whilst reading it, like, oh, this translator is a good writer. It's not just the writer who's a good writer. And every time I read a book for this podcast or a book translated from Chinese for my own enjoyment, I like it. I don't mind being made a little more self-conscious as I read. In my opinion, it's kind of a good thing. So I don't, if it is an indulgence, personally, I think it's a good one.
Well, thank you for that, Angus.
That's all right. Yeah, I enjoyed reading your notes. I read them all before reading the book, and it did prime me nicely, help me understand what I was reading it as I was reading it, rather than after the fact. So that's all my publishing angle questions. We can go on to talking about the big personality herself, Sanmao. So you mentioned her birth name was Chen Maoping.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about her pen name, I suppose, Sanmao. How about Echo Chan? Who's Echo Chan?
Yes. So there's that interesting triangulation of her identities. Echo was the name by which she was known to her non-Chinese friends. I think it was a name that she adopted while I think it actually, from what I read or understood, it was a name that she had come to thanks to one of her teachers in Taiwan. But when she was living and studying abroad, that was when she really assumed the mantle of Echo, I guess. So to her non-Chinese friends, she was Echo.
Right. I was talking in the group chat, one that I mentioned earlier, about the kind of the modern, what's the proliferation or just commonness? Commonness is not a good adjective, but the frequency that you'd come across Chinese women with an English name, Echo. And it occurred to me actually like the very first like TEFL teaching English in China job I had was for a company called Echo English, and now I'm wondering, was the boss of that company a Sanmao fan? Possibly, possibly not.
Very possible, because most, if not all, of the Chinese women or Taiwanese women who I've met who call themselves Echo took that name based on their appreciation or passion for Sanmao herself.
Yeah, actually, one of the Echoes I knew was like doing her own blog on WeChat, what they call a WeChat official account. So I didn't know it at the time, but that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a question I have 3 skips ahead here down my list of questions, which I realize I should have put directly below this one about the triangulated identity of Chen Maoping, Sanmao, Echo Chan. This is a question preceded by a tangent, so I apologize to all the listeners and yourself, but this question will make sense after I've preluded it with the tangent. So one of my favorite ever TV shows, Mr. Robot, just ended recently. And in Mr. Robot, there's a mega corporation called E Corp. And every time the main character, who we are very much in the head of, well, he thinks of them as Evil Corp, not E Corp, but Evil Corp. So every single time any character or any logo of E Corp appears, it's not spoken or visualized as E Corp. We hear and we see Evil Corp. And that was kind of in my mind as I was reading Stories of the Sahara, because I was wondering, when a character says, "Oh, Sanmao, come here," in reality, were they really calling her Sanmao like they are on the page, or were they calling her Echo? And for the sake of, I don't know, coherence or presenting a particular picture, was Sanmao writing Sanmao and not Echo, or was she writing Sanmao and not Chen Maoping or Maoping? So 2 questions here. One is, do you actually know? Which is probably a boring question. And the second, more interesting question, how big do you think the gap is between the writer's persona on the page of Sanmao and the real person off the page, whoever that person is?
Great questions.
Thank you.
I cannot fact check this, but I'm pretty positive that nobody called her Sanmao in real life. At least in this time writing these stories in Africa. She was Echo to everyone, especially her husband. Right. Her husband's family. I think everybody who met her while she was in the West, or when studying in Europe, in the US or whatever, she was Echo. The fact that she chooses to, in the book, throughout the book, when she appears in dialogue, it's always Sanmao. Echo appears nowhere in the book. I think it's a very deliberate choice, actually.
Right.
And I think a similar question came up at my book launch last week in Brooklyn, but I feel like it's almost as though she's winking at the reader in these instances. For somebody who doesn't know much about her, they might just see Sanmao appear in dialogue and shrug it off, or just assume, hey, it's her pen name, it's who she was, it's what people called her. But I don't know, maybe others, she assumes there are other people who understand more of the lived reality of her life, and and knew enough of that she was not called Sanmao really by anybody in like day-to-day interactions.
That is very interesting. Thanks for that answer. Sorry, what were you going to say?
One note I want to add to that is, of course, later, once she had established herself as a literary figure and cultural icon, I'm sure people referred to her as Sanmao in the press, and that was the name by which she was known for the rest of her life in in the public sphere. So
Right.
whether or not people in her personal life addressed her outright as Sanmao, I feel like that's questionable, at least.
But at least at this time, before she kind of really blew up, definitely it's kind of a literary construction. Interesting. Because I wouldn't necessarily have guessed that. It would have been one of my possible guesses, but maybe not my number one. Yeah. So next question. It's another, well, they're all questions about the author, but very much like about her as a person, because I feel like that's the first place your kind of proverbial eye is drawn when you're reading. Sanmao's attitude towards life, I think, really permeates her writing, at least in this book, because obviously I've not read anything else by her. I think that's a kind of a safe statement or assumption. But I'm wondering if you could succinctly or prosaically describe what was her attitude towards life, at least when she was in the Sahara.
I think she espouses this very 70s sort of or like a ideal of loving, your fellow humankind and seeing the humanity in all the people around you, no matter how distant you may feel from them culturally or linguistically. Yeah, very bohemian in that way. I've been asked if she could be considered a hippie, and I don't think she quite fits the bill to that extreme. But I think, a lot of her writing of this time seems to really, she seems to really internalize maybe some of the sort of global trends of the 60s and 70s. And so she's very, she has a lot of pathos, and she's very warm-hearted, expresses warmth and affection to those in her life, really witty and just funny, sharp eye, kind of charming woman all around, really.
Yeah, if I had a time machine, I'd live through the 60s and 70s and then skip the 80s, definitely. So you've kind of preempted or covered my question about was she a hippie, but there was a little subset to that question as to, and I don't necessarily think you would be an expert on this. I'm just curious if you know how much the term hippie, as I would use it, applies to 70s or 80s or 60s, 60s, 70s, 80s, Taiwan or China. I think I have an idea of how little it applies to mainland China. I have no idea about Taiwan.
Yeah, mainland China, not a thing. Cultural revolution,
A different kind of hippies.
kind of the anti-hippie in some ways.
Yes.
Taiwan, good question. I have no idea. I don't have the context for that, but I imagine probably not very prevalent in terms of cultural influence, save for among those who had opportunities to spend long periods of time either with foreigners or abroad. Yeah.
Right.
Sanmao herself, I don't think she was a hippie. I mean, I think there's one story, the word hippie appears once in the whole book too, and it's in a story where she's referencing some kind of tragedy that happened in the desert, something about hippies dying in like
Oh yeah.
Night in the Wasteland. And there's another moment too where she references something else that's very much like a cultural touchstone of the time about, she describes herself, I mean, she's very independent and strong-headed, and I would say, many people would say she's a feminist and espouses those values. But in one of her first stories, which I've translated as A Desert Diner, in the second or third paragraph, she says, I'm not a, supporter of the women's liberation movement. She says that very directly. And
did she say not a supporter or not part?
in the Chinese, she says, I'm not a supporter.
Right.
So that's pretty direct. I think I tried different ways of softening that because it felt a little bit counter to what I understood of her or thought, imagined her to be. But I think what she meant to say there is that she's really not, let's say, an ardent activist. It's like participating in what was happening at the time, demonstrating for women's liberation in the 70s. Even though she does also in the same, story, voice her very strong opinions about what she wants from marriage, how she views her marriage, what she tells Jose about their possible marriage, all those things, right? Yeah.
Yeah. This is completely going on another kind of strange cultural reference. There's a British documentary maker called Adam Curtis he's made lots of amazing kind of strange stylized documentaries, but the first one of his I ever saw was called Century of the Self, which I think it starts from maybe like the 50s and psychoanalysis, but in the middle section deals with how this kind of idea of a self pinballed from right wing, left wing, or whatever you want to call it, egalitarian and reactionary cultural movements. And at the time of maybe like the 70s, it was in the left side of the ballpark. And the kind of, although there's like this hippie progressive feeling in the air, there's also the strong individualistic thing. And that's kind of what popped into your head when you were saying the maybe contradictory things about Sanmao there. She's behaves in a very kind of forward thinking progressive way, but her own self is also at the forefront. I don't really have a question there. Just I like throwing in these references. Yeah, I've now completely derailed myself. Probably just flick to page 2 because I don't think I have any more questions about hippies. These questions are about the story. So there's a huge amount in the story to talk about, and quite a lot of the things Sanma was writing about align with my own kind of things I'm interested in, things I weren't expecting. So I could start with things that don't necessarily press my buttons and then get to the strange things, but I'm gonna eat the dessert first, go straight to the weird, strange things going on in the edges of the book. Yeah. So like really early on, Sanmao says, I say really early on, in one of the early chapters, that's making it a bit clearer. She says strange things happen in the Sahara, and she's proven, at least by her own story, correct, because there's throughout the course of the book, there's a UFO, there's a pagan curse, which seems disturbingly, frighteningly real. There's malevolent spirits, and there are other smaller things that are kind of defy. You could probably describe them in an essay. I don't have a single noun or adjective that describes the kind of weirdness going on in the background of this book, which is mostly kind of chatty and realistic and everyday, and that's what makes it so likable. I feel like it's kind of impressive that she achieved that fusion in her writing, whether she was going for it or not. But what I've got, I think I asked you this earlier about the character Leo in Leo Mang. Am I just projecting the things I'm interested in, or is this weirdness, in your opinion, really there in Sanmao's writing?
The weirdness is definitely there. I think that's part of what makes her so, I don't know, it was so interesting for me to read, at least the first time. Whether or not the weirdness correlates to something she actually experienced, I think that's debatable. But I do think that she made conscious decisions to share some of these supernatural or like odd occurrences that may or may not have been happening around her in this book in particular.
Yeah. I know I already plugged the show Mr. Robot, but I'd like to plug up a podcast I actually recommended before on the show. If anyone listening really likes the kind of strange and things which, if they were lowbrow or presented in a lowbrow way, would be called paranormal, but these days you can present as highbrow if you call it weird with a capital W. There's a podcast called Weird Studies. If you like weird studies, if you like how the title sounds, check out that podcast. And if you're already into things like that, don't be put off by the realistic veneer, I suppose, of Stories of the Sahara, because there's some genuinely strange things which I could get into, but it would take too long. I'll just ask you this, Mike. Which unnatural or paranormal or whatever you want to call it episode in the book kind of made you put the shiver up your spine the most?
Great question. I would say,
I'm glad you didn't ask me, because I'd be umming and ahhing all day.
Yeah, I think the cursed necklace was probably the most disturbing one. But it's also the most elaborate. We spend the most, it's a full chapter, it's a lot of events unfold, and
Right.
um, yeah, I think she goes into extreme detail about the afflictions that she supposedly encountered through that cursed necklace. The UFO feels like a bit of a footnote in an otherwise hodgepodge kind of chapter.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the one about the genie is it's interesting, but I guess I don't know. I like the cursed necklace. The chapter is called "A Seed of Death."
Yes. A clue in the name that something scary is going to happen. I think that one, while I don't know if it was my favorite, that's definitely like the weirdest with the capital W because I guess the unknown or the mysterious or malevolent thing is you really don't know what it is because it's not something you can put a face to like an alien or a genie or a ghost. It really is like some strange force. You find out later, spoilers, it might be a curse, but I don't know what is a curse. It's not something you can grasp as easily. And yeah, that I think the chapter with the genie scared me a wee bit, but that one with the necklace where it gets the things it does, which I won't go into. I mean, who knows? Maybe she was exaggerating or fabricating, but it comes across so icky and violent and frightening in the story. It
Yeah, it's
really
very.
jolted me.
She describes in lurid detail all of the things that befall her, and I think yeah, it's a very interesting and well written chapter.
Definitely. Um, Time for a slightly plainer question. Another, what's your favorite form of question? Other than Sanmao, because she's a very big character, other than her, did you have a favorite character?
Oh, I mean, is it cliche if I say Jose?
No. Yeah. Be honest.
Yeah, I think Jose is probably there's quite a few a handful of major or like supporting characters. I think Jose is the one who feels the most solid after spending time with this book over the past years, and I think I like the picture of their domestic life that she paints through her writing and the different scenarios that both of them are implicated in. I think I think it gives the reader hopefully a sense of who she felt Jose was through these stories and through their interactions. And I don't know. I think for me, it always, it felt like a very rounded relationship. Or by her telling, by Sanmao's telling, I felt like I could understand their dynamic very well.
Hmm.
My first reading the book, let alone spending many more years with it and translating it.
Yeah, it seems like she really knew him and he knew her, or even if they didn't, because he's not the most verbose is maybe the wrong word. He's not the most extroverted character.
Mm-hmm.
He comes across as a man of few words, but when he does speak or when he does take an action, it says a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's possibly my at least my favorite like fully rounded character. But I really liked a lot of the more kind of sketched characters that we get kind of snatched glimpses of, and a lot of them are colored by where they're from or their ethnicity or their identity in the Western Sahara, which we'll get into more in a minute. But just want to ask you, what did you think of her briefer sketches, like one-off or two-off Spanish and native Sahrawi characters? And also, I should probably, because it's the word hasn't come up before, what does it mean to be Sahrawi? Who is a Sahrawi? And am I pronouncing the word right?
I have the same question for myself, but the Sahrawi are the indigenous people of the Western Sahara. They are Muslims by religion. They speak Hassaniya Arabic, and at the time of Samao's writing, they were living under a Spanish colonial administration, and thus, many were. I don't know if they were forced to, but some Sahrawi of that region could speak Spanish, and that was the primary means of communicating with the colonizers. Um, yeah.
Yep. And what did you think about the some of the more colonial Spanish and well, yeah, some of the more maybe Spanish characters who are part of the colonial apparatus, and also the native characters completely detached from that apparatus. Did you have any favorites or moments that stuck out at you?
I like the character of Salun, who's the grocery store clerk.
Oh, yeah.
Features in a particularly memorable story. I don't know for certain if he's a Sahrawi. I don't think that's mentioned actually, now that I think about it. But
No, but yeah, I have no idea.
yeah, he he's somebody from, let's say, Western Africa. Yeah, I think just the way that that story unfolds, I think it's it felt, it was one of the pieces that when I was reading the book for the first time, I just thought like, wow, like what, regardless of the veracity of all of the events in this book, I think her somehow sense of narrative and her sort of, insights into this character and the story that unfolds from him, I thought those were very compelling for me. As for the other Spanish colonial administrators, there are very few that stick out. I think most of them are very sketches. They're main sketches of characters more so than anything else. But I like that they're there. People like the secretary at the courthouse, or the sort of like vapid wives of the Spanish bureaucrats. I think those, she, again, like how much of that is part and parcel of reality, and how much she kind of invented or inserted for her own narrative, who knows? But I like that she has these characters to offset some of her and Jose's own predicaments or circumstances or worldviews, whatnot.
I have to say, the scene where there's some of those, as you said, vapid Spanish wives, they're in a local, I don't know what you'd say, a local strongman's mansion, and they're being given all the luxury foods, and they're turning up their noses. They're saying horrible things about local cuisine whilst being waited on hand and feet. And I was like, oh yes, I've been in this exact situation at teacher banquets put on by the school I was working at, where I suppose that wasn't a colonial relationship, but I felt like I'd met those people in some form or other. And Saloon, the store clerk, I don't know if I've strictly met someone like that, but he felt like someone I could meet, maybe because, like you said, of Sanmao's psychological understanding and her ability to put it into words on the page. So speaking about Spanish and Sahrawi characters and the setting and the colonial situation, that kind of leads me on to this next wee tangent, this wee prelude to a little trio of questions. I've found in my both as like reading for pleasure, research for this podcast, and research I did for my dissertation when I was doing my publishing masters, which was on it was on Chinese sci-fi, but also to some extent other translated Chinese books. What I kind of found was that often C2E, Chinese to English books, are marketed often like on the quotes on the cover as an insight into China, or something to that effect. And often as a reader and as a podcaster, I do actually read the books in that way, and I talk about them in that way. And I don't feel like I'm necessarily guilty just for following a commercial or possibly reductive trend. Like, that approach has some value, even if it is limiting, if it's the only approach you have. But yeah, like if a book's in Old Shanghai, I want to treat that book, I'll often want to treat that book as a teleporter or a time machine to take me there back in time and to that place. It's not an invalid way of reading books from other times or other places or other languages. But here, this is a really different case for me, because this is a book that's translated from Chinese, but you could kind of call it a strange case because it's from, we have a writer who's from Taiwan, which is perhaps a disputed, I don't know why I'm saying perhaps, but I say with some degree of sensitivity, a disputed Asian territory. This person from Taiwan who's living in a disputed African territory, West Sahara, which I remember I learned about as like a teenager. I read some factoid in some books saying it was the only country in the world without a government, which, I don't know, that seems like a tenuous claim. But like the point still stands. It was a disputed, weird territory when Sanmao was living there.
It still
and it still is, right? So nothing's changed, or maybe some things have changed when I was a teenager, but the essence of it being a weird borderland, non-space, still applies. So I've got a trio of questions for you. Let's start with number one. That would make sense. What is, in your words, the Western Sahara?
The Western Sahara is the former colony of Spain, the Spanish Sahara. Um, my knowledge of the Spanish Empire and its colonial history is unfortunately a bit spotty, but Sanmao was living there during the last years of Spain's colonial rule over this land, and presently it's administered by Morocco.
Right.
There is an active independence and self-determination movement among the Sahrawi, who are as we've mentioned before, the indigenous people of the land. Who I believe it's in the southwest of Morocco currently.
Right. So if I was to look on a map, would I, like a regularly updated digital map, which I should have done before this recording, do you know if I would see it contained within Morocco, or would it still be listed as a separate non-place? Do you know?
It's within Morocco by official maps.
Right.
But just Googled it now. It says El Ayoun is the largest city of the disputed territory of Western Sahara and de facto administered by Morocco.
And sorry, can you, how do I say that?
I say it El Ayoun, but there's also
Ayoun.
a sort of French version, which is L'Ayoun.
Okay, so El Ayoun or Layoun, that's where Sanma was living. So, like before I picked up the book, I thought, oh wait, she was actually in the Sahara. She was in the desert. But strictly speaking, well, not strictly speaking, once you open the book, you find she was in this town, which, like you said, still exists and is still an administrative center. Right. Second question: if you read between the lines in this book, do you think the book says anything about Sanmao's passport identity? Because from what I noticed, she refers to herself as Chinese. I don't remember. Maybe I could be wrong here, but I don't remember seeing the word Taiwanese. I think I remember seeing the word Taiwan because that's where her parents are. But the word Chinese that's what's in my memory.
Yeah.
So is there something going on between the lines, or am I just looking for something that isn't necessarily there?
I think to me, it seems clear that she is a holder of, she's a dual citizen after her marriage to Jose. So she's a citizen of Spain, in addition to the Republic of China or Taiwan. So you're right that she never refers to herself as a Taiwanese person. She mentions Taiwan a few times throughout the book in reference to family members. But throughout most of it, when it comes to cultural identity, she has this tendency to really convey pride in this sort of what I call like a mythic Chinese identity. She sees herself as a Chinese woman. And that's, I think there's a certain ambiguity sometimes in the way that we talk about or translate what the word Chinese might be. Is it, 中国人, or is it 华人, or is it, anything else? There's so many different variations, But in the book, she definitely, I think more than once, she refers to herself as a 中国人, a Chinese person, a person from China.
Right.
But I think she, to put that in context, it is she was born in China, what was then and what is still now China, under governments. But it's a really interesting question, the whole matter of nationality and her self-identification amid all that.
Yeah, I totally forgot to mention the the Spanish passport or whatever identity. I'm glad you mentioned that. A third question here, also bringing up maps. So I was doing, again, some more lazy internet research. I went on Google Maps and I zoomed in on El Ayoun, the town where she was living the setting of this book essentially. And I think I typed in the word Sanmao, or I was looking for absolutely anything Sanmao-ish or Chinese, I suppose, in case anyone had relocated there. And I found that there is a Sanmao hotel, which, as far as I can tell, looks like a pretty normal hotel for the town with some middling reviews. Would you ever want to go to El Ayoun / go there and stay in the Sanmao hotel?
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, a bit chagrined to say that I haven't been out there yet. I did get to the Canary Islands, which is about an hour's flight away from LA, but I have not been to Africa at all, Morocco,
Mm.
Sahara.
Yeah, I've been to, well, humble brag, I've been to quite a lot of countries, but a lot of mainland European countries, given that they're not so far away from Scotland where I live. But I've never been to Spain unless you count Tenerife. I have been to Tenerife, which is
Mhm.
I think that's kind of nearish the Canary Islands, right? Off the coast of Africa.
It's one of them, one of the Canary Islands.
Ah, right.
It's a city in one of the Canary Islands, I
Oh,
think.
there you go. I'm so ignorant. I didn't even realize I had been to the Canary Islands. But yeah, yeah, that question doesn't go
Yes.
anywhere. But
Oh, it's the largest of the Canary Islands. I'm
aha,
also learned of the geography there.
there you go. The more you know. That is all my story questions. So now some technical translation-y questions, since you are the translator of this book. In the paratexts I mentioned in your translator's note, you talk a little bit about the challenges of translating Sanmao and her writing, and very helpfully, you've broken those challenges into categories, and they've been typeset with, well, I don't know if you how you rendered the subheadings in your manuscript, but they're in very nice subheadings in the book, and that's helped me order my questions very nicely. So first, you mentioned how you found the original edition, how you found San Mao's Stories of Sahara, and how it touched you both as a reader and as a Chinese American. Now, I'm a reader. I have lived far from home, and as a Scot, I maybe have a wee bit of a dual national identity or some level of ambiguity there. But to be very frank, of course, I'm not Chinese. I'm not American either. And maybe most fundamentally, I'm not you. So can you tell me and the listeners how this book touched you?
Yeah, certainly. So a friend gave me the book for my 26th birthday a while back, and it was a casual gift, and I found myself just reading it on the subway every day, and I was immediately taken by it in a way that was, to be honest, a bit of a shock. So I was born in China, and I
Mm,
moved abroad when I was 4, first to Denmark and then the United States. So I've been living in the US since I was 5 years old essentially, and went to Chinese language schools growing up on the weekend, but after a certain age, really had no interest in or desire to practice my Chinese or grow my Chinese past a certain ability.
right.
So all that said, I mean, I did eventually go back to school to study Chinese film and literature to a degree. I think Chinese language reading is still incredibly draining for me because I have not spent more than at most a couple of months living in China as an adult.
Right.
Well, even as a translator, I live in New York City. I have Chinese friends, but do I even speak Chinese every day of my life? No, no way. Um,
And you're not getting the kind of on the street speak.
yeah, so when I first read this book, which it was 2011, the way that my uh, how to say it? I mean, I think I was just like really shocked by how emotionally connected I felt to the book when I first read it as an adult.
Mm.
And I think there was something, and maybe it sort of aligned with a particular frame of mind or, my own emotional state of that time, of that age.
Mm.
But
I'm trying to think of a better word than shocked. Maybe taken unaware?
yeah, I think I was just like, wow, like there's something about her sensibilities that just felt like it reached over, the decades and
Mm.
thousands of miles and languages to really, shake me in a certain way. And I was really taken by it. And I knew immediately that it was a project that I wanted to translate once I realized that it had never been translated before. That was the second shock, I guess.
Right. Like when you said she wasn't a hippie, I think there's truth there. She's not just a hippie. I mean, even if I called her like a romantic, like in the literary sense, that maybe doesn't quite get to the fundamental thing of the poetic spirit or whatever spirit she had
Mhm.
can cross lots of different boundaries for sure. And I mean, your story is in a way it's really personal, but I'm sure the way it touched me probably didn't have quite a hit that had any deep attachment to my identity, but it still hit me in a way other writers couldn't, because other writers aren't her, and her individuality just comes right out the page, even through not to diminish your translation, but even through translation, it's still felt like a little bit of a direct line.
No, I get it. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's how it felt to me too. I think thank you for yeah, saying that, because I think that's what I was getting at. Like the immediacy of her voice was something that was just very surprising, caught me off guard, I would say. You know,
Yeah.
right? It's like in my mid-20s in New York City in 2011, and reading these stories written by a woman from Taiwan in 1976 or early mid 70s, and just found them so incredibly compelling and funny and poignant, and yeah, there was a lot in there, a lot to unpack and sift through.
Bringing back weird topics, I've been reading Philip K. Dick's Exegesis of late. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't actually.
Oh, suffice to say, he wrote it. It's like a big screed he wrote over years when he's in a very strange state of mind. There's a lot of ideas about time and how time is illusory, or how all times are folded on top of each other. And like as a piece of science or philosophy, of course, it's nonsense. But like poetically, there's a lot of resonance there where, yeah, you do get the sense that, okay, she's passed away. The 70s are long gone, but are they long gone if these words can have this time machine effect on you? I say at the risk of repeating myself, but I think it's good to emphasize it. But let's not emphasize too much. Let's charge on. If you had a heading, I don't know if this is my version of the heading. I've got the word mechanics here. You mentioned that you opted to standardize Sanmao's vernacular Chinese into I don't know if into is the right word, but you rendered it as straightforward English. Did putting Sanmao's Chinese into straightforward English force any, well, I'm sure there's always tricky choices in translation, but did it force any really tricky choices or compromises, or was it not too tough?
I think this note was mostly about the way in which dialogue is rendered in Chinese text sometimes without the sort of subject being denoted until the very end of a long passage or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. I think this one was something that I didn't do a lot of edit. It wasn't a lot of shifting, really. It was just trying to maybe move a thing or two around to make it seem more natural in English, if that makes any sense.
Actually, I'm not a translator at all, but some work I was doing for the publisher today involved rendering an author bio, a mini bio, like a little paragraph or whatever, into English. And how I was doing that was took the Chinese text, shoved it into Google Translate, and then using a little bit of the original and a little bit of the raw Google Translate, put it into English. And yeah, I found exactly what you described. There was rather than conclusion and then explanations for the conclusion, it was careful point 1, careful point 2, literally numbered 1 and 2, and then the point they were trying to make. So I thought I can't keep this as it is in English. It quote unquote doesn't logically make sense. So yeah, like you said, maybe it's not a deeply philosophical thing, just a question of ordering that comes up in CTE.
To seem natural in English, mostly.
Yeah. Not having it be, as much as I said I like meta things. You don't want a bad kind of pushing you out the book. You want a good, engaging kind. But before I start really talking out my ass, the next heading, style. So this bit I found really interesting. Rather than me going into it and analyzing it myself, I'll just ask you, what is Sanmao's style, her literary style, and how did you as a translator deal with it?
I think it's both colloquial in that something that I felt when I was reading it for the first time, and something that I've seen or heard other people describe her writing as, is that it sounds like reading her text is like listening to a friend of yours talk. It's very direct and easily understood. I think there's that sort of side to it, very colloquial. The other side is that she does, she did have a lot of she read a lot as a child and had a very literary upbringing. She was very well versed in Chinese classics like Dream of the Red Chamber and Water Margin, and in addition to Western literature, French and Russian authors and so on. So I think the Chinese side of it, she there are definitely some stories more so than others where she likes to inject some allusions to Chinese poetry or Chinese literary references in general.
Just after I asked that question, I decided to pick up the book and open at a random page. And then, as I was scanning the page for a fun paragraph, you mentioned references to Chinese and Western, well, literature, I guess. And sure enough, I've got one. So I'll just read. It's 2 short paragraphs. I'll read them as swiftly as I can, and then maybe if you have any memory of translating them, or if you have any comments to make on them, go for it. So I'll start now, and I'll try not to be too indulgent. I'll get done as fast as I can without reading at rapid speed. Here we go. The sun poured down like molten iron. I'd been outside so long that the ground and sky seemed to spin slowly. Jose didn't speak at all, like Sisyphus pushing his huge rock. I was enormously proud to have a husband like that. Before I'd seen only his neatly printed documents and love letters. Now I was getting to know a whole new side of him. Jose lay on the ground after we ate our veggie medley. He was already asleep by the time I came in from the kitchen. I couldn't bear to wake him, so I crept up to the roof and moved down the planks he'd sawn up, separating them into piles for our table, bookshelf, wardrobe, and coffee table. It was sunset by the time he awoke. He leapt to his feet. "Why didn't you wake me up?" he asked angrily. So not the most sensational passage, but how's Sanmao's style embodying itself here?
I think the Sisyphus translation was a direct, the reference to Sisyphus was a direct translation.
Right, not a substitution from a Chinese Sisyphus.
Oh no, there was none of that.
Right.
Yeah, I think in this in my memory is a very straightforward passage. It's from the story about her first arriving in the desert and really setting up her home with Jose. Yeah, I think she moves very fluidly between her interiority and the external world and the actions that she's describing. I would say that that's a very emblematic passage of her style in general.
Fairly said. Next wee heading was Spanish and Arabic, and this is something I found interesting. I'm quite interested or intellectually tickled or whatever by transliteration. I always liked learning a Chinese word which was made of characters that sounded like a word from a foreign language. Sandwich is my favorite. So I learned here in your note that Sanmao transliterated lots of words from Spanish and Arabic into Chinese characters. My Spanish and Arabic are pretty much non-existent, so I can't think of any. I don't know any of them would be, but I think you made a great choice that involved a little bit of effort on your part, where you took these transliterated Chinese words, which are just sounds, you traced them back to the source languages, Spanish and Arabic, and then you rendered them back into English and italicized them. Oh no, sorry. You kept them in their original language and italicized them, as like a word from a foreign language often is if you keep it in that language in English text. I hope I didn't explain that in too much of a convoluted way. So the question I want to ask is, did you end up learning much Spanish or Arabic or indeed Sahrawi when you were working on this book? And if you do you have any favorites or ones that have stuck with you?
I think there are a bunch of Spanish or Arabic phrases peppered throughout the book. Nothing too dramatic in terms of the actual dialogue. Of the research that I did was in regard to the proper names of characters and places.
Right.
That's required a bit more digging and consultation to properly identify or figure out. Really, there were A few that were real that really stumped me and stumped everybody I came across, including the other translators of Sanmao's book into Spanish, Catalan, and Dutch. Uh,
Mm.
the one that I felt very pleased about, I would say, is in two of the stories. There's a figure that appears that's only referenced, not an actual character, but she calls it. She writes in Chinese as "shan dong," like "shan" as in mountain and "dong" as in 一栋楼, like a building, 一栋楼, that kind of thing.
Oh, that
Um,
is a new character for me.
yeah,
Okay.
Shandong. I was
Okay.
like, what is a Shandong? Because she describes the Shandong as somebody who's like a holy person, and I was like, is
Mm.
in another story I was able to find. Okay, she's talking about an imam here, like in Islam.
Right, which would be kind of easy to put in transliterated Chinese, like Yi Man or Yi Man or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is, but she referred to it something as like a holy man of like Muslim faith or something like that. But
Right.
Shandong was something else, and it wasn't until a very late, like 11th hour consultation with um, uh, a Sahrawi academic that I'd been put in touch with thanks to some random people I emailed on the internet. But we figured out that Shandong, the term Shandong in this book, in the context that she used, it was actually a Spanish phrase,
Ah,
Santon, um,
right.
man. And I cannot thank enough. My consultant for that. It was truly, it felt like the cherry on top of this whole ordeal. I just felt really like I wanted to do my due diligence, but I didn't want to leave, just Shandong in italics. This like
No,
clear
because it'll look like the province.
exactly, right? Like we're not talking about Shandong here, but like I would
No.
when he really figured out that it was Santong, I thought, oh my God, like it's amazing. Like language is so interesting. I love that it took so many leaps from probably Samao hearing this, in conversation while living in Africa in the 70s to transliterating the phrase as Shandong in her writing, and then decades later, here I am, like communicating with a stranger from the internet, trying to um, put this together or figure out what exactly she was referring to, and it
Mm.
was a lovely like eureka moment, really.
Well, hooray for random people on the internet. It's a lifesaver.
Voice.
Yeah, transliteration into Chinese rather like you said, it is a fun thing. The kind of almost games you can do with language. Like I would bet Shandong that must be the only or the first time that was ever rendered in Chinese. It must have been, and I imagine some of the other transliterated words might not have existed, maybe only exist in the Sanmao branch of the World Library. I have a funny wee anecdote. I think it's too good not to share. I had a Dundonian friend, so a fellow person from Dundee in Scotland, like I am, on WeChat, the Chinese like instant messaging app, and we had a little game where we would try and write Scottish and Dundonian slang, but only in Chinese characters, and then work out what the other person was saying. And yeah, sometimes it was really obvious, and other times it was like required a little bit of detective work and sideways thinking. But
Yeah,
and
I love
yeah,
words like that. That's very intriguing.
yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into detail because it might come off treating the language a bit flippantly, but it's a fun game. I'll say that much. Last wee heading you had here, speaking of language games, Chongyu, for the non-initiated, although I think a lot of our listeners are the initiated, what are Chongyu? And can you give an example of one that Sanmao used, which you had to translate?
Chengyu are essentially idioms in Chinese.
Mm.
They are more usually four character phrases in which it's like a pithy form of a much more elaborate sentiment, really. So there are some Chengyu that I think have direct equivalents in English and are easy to translate, easy in scare quotes to translate,
Right.
like 一举两得. literally means, well, I translated it as killing two birds with one stone, but that's essentially the sentiment. Um, I'm sure there's some kind of more complex historical allusion in there, but 一举两得 is, 举 it means to raise, and 得 is to receive. So something about lifting or raising something once and receiving twice as much in return, something like that.
Cultivation sort of a thing.
I'm sure something like that.
Right.
There are other 成语 that are more complex, and that's both the beauty and the frustration and sort of the endlessness of Chinese language, is that many 成语 are a story unto themselves. And yeah, you can spend hours, hundreds of hours digging through and really trying to learn. And I think many of these things they come more naturally to people who have grown up in a Chinese language educational system, which I did not. So I think as a translator, it's a challenge, but it's also a lot of fun. I think I'm really grateful for having been able to engage in that way.
I think my favorite one, and it was one I didn't know if this is something you plucked from English or you created yourself or translated fairly directly from the Chinese. And I'm going to misquote it probably. I'm hoping my misquote will help you recall how it's actually rendered. It's like a bush between neighbors helps the relationship.
Oh yeah, a hedge between keeps friendships green. Or
there you go.
That.
Yes, with a rhyme.
Yeah,
that was my fave.
Yes, I wish I could say I remember what the actual Chinese phrase was. I'd have to go back and look at that story, but that was the one about all the neighbors coming by and borrowing her things, right?
Yes, unbelievable that they would do that. But yeah, that was one of the more entertaining parts of the story. I don't think I've asked you actually. I guess I wondered if it might come up, and I guess it kind of has. In your translator's note, you mentioned you had a little bit of a consideration of how to treat what can you say? The parts of Sanmao's writings that weren't quite so that were a little bit judgmental of other people, because she seemed like she's fairly judgmental, and you decided to preserve it and keep her as a rounded / contradictory writer rather than trying to smooth out the edges. Can you talk a wee bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, this is mostly in relation to the Sahrawi characters. She does have some, I would say, unsavory judgments of the Sahrawi, the indigenous people, who mostly live in tents and have a nomadic lifestyle. But she describes their body odor and hygienic practices in less than flattering terms. And that's something that appears throughout the book, not sort of very heavy-handed, but it is, I would say, a note that she returns to more than once. And I think, I don't know. I didn't want to sort of explain away any of that or, editorialize and decide that, we want to really scrub clean her image for the benefit of the Western reader. I felt like she was writing this material in the 70s in a very different time and place, and not to excuse her for any of those judgments, but, I think she was writing also for a Chinese language audience. She probably early on in her career had no inkling that this would ever go beyond, like, let's say the newspaper reading public of Taipei, and I just felt like it was really in my power, or it wasn't really up to me or my editor to decide to remove those unsavory bits, as cringy as some of them may have.
Yeah, well, I think it wouldn't have been good to erase the kind of, I don't know if culture clash is probably not quite the right concept, but she was living in a society, or she'd chosen to live in a society very different from the one she come from. And it would feel weird if there was absolutely no friction or collision or confusion on her part, even, with or without slightly unfair judgments. So I think, without getting into it any more than that, I really think you made the right choice there, and appreciated it, and appreciated the meta aspect of reading about your considering the question in the translator's note. Definitely appreciated all that. That's the last question I've got translation wise. Now we're getting near the end. So We already touched on red dust and olive trees and the kind of sadness in those things. I guess we talked about the song The Olive Tree more than the film Red Dust. I definitely heard about the film Red Dust a fair bit, as well as hearing about stories of the Sahara before I actually sought them out. You told us the story of how you first came across stories of the Sahara. So my questions are: have you seen Red Dust? And when you saw it for the first time, how did that come about, if you remember?
Yes, I've seen Red Dust exactly once. A couple of years ago, there was a screening of it in. There's a wonderful theater in New York's Lower East Side called Metrograph, and they happened to be playing it. I think it was part of a larger series. I forget which, but I saw it over there. Yeah, Red Dust came out in 1990, I believe.
Yeah.
And you said you've watched about a third of it thus far?
Yeah, right before going on the line with you, yeah, watching it not very legally online. And I think whilst I was searching for said not very legal streaming venue, I came across some event pages for American screenings of the film. One of them could very well have been the event you attended.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's a historical epic, and it was made in a different era. It features some very iconic actors from the time,
Right.
from Hong Kong and Taiwan primarily, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I like the film. I like the intent behind the film. I found that I don't know. It was, I think maybe the way in which I'm going to stop myself there. I don't know.
It's okay. I have to do that to myself sometimes. I'll have an opinion instead, based on the whole third of it I've watched. Or sorry, this isn't an opinion. This is a safe question, let's say. I heard, and my viewing of it thus far seems to confirm what I heard. I think this might have been from that Instagram group chat, that it's a little bit of homage or possibly inspired by Lost Caution by Zhang Aileen, which is a story I've already covered on the podcast, and it's actually, I think if you don't include the very first episode, it's the one that's had the most listens. It's had a lot of love online. Do you know much about that?
About Zhang Ailing and the connection with
So
Red Dust?
Yeah, and Lost Caution, and maybe the historical events that Lost Caution was based on. Do you know much about that?
I love Lost Caution, the film. Ang Lee is one of my favorite directors.
Mm.
And I have read some works of Eileen Chang, mostly in translation. Yeah, and personally, I'm also very fascinated by that era, the tumult of the 30s and 40s, and Republic in China, especially Shanghai during that time. I think those,
Right.
it was a hotbed of political intrigue and devastation, and yeah, I don't know. It's a very interesting time. And I think that's why it still resonates with so many writers and filmmakers this many.
Totally. I think I might have told this story on the podcast before. I might not. What you said about wartime Shanghai, I'll tell this as quickly as I can. Have you ever read Empire of the Sun?
I haven't read it, but I have seen the Spielberg film from the early 90s, right?
Right, yes. So the author of the book is J.G. Ballard, I think he's probably best known for Empire of the Sun, but was mostly a sci-fi writer, a British sci-fi writer. And he grew up in colonial Shanghai. And when he was a wee boy, it became colonial Shanghai, occupied by the Japanese army. And him and his family were sent to live in a detention center for Allied foreigners, as strange as that phrase is. So people like Americans, Belgians, French, British people. And what happens to the wee boy in Empire of the Sun is basically the same as what happened to him, except he wasn't separated from his parents. Anyway, the funny anecdote part, or funny in the sense of strange part of the story is the school I worked at during pretty much all my time in Shanghai was built or it was a school before and it became a different school after. It was the site of that prison. So yeah, crazy. If you're in Shanghai or if other listeners are, it's Shanghai High School. Yeah, it's the home to the Shanghai High School International Division and the local division.
Oh, amazing! That's my sister went to high school actually.
Oh, right.
Yeah, 国际部.
Shanghai 中学国际部. The original Shanghai High School has changed locations a few times. It goes back to the late Qing. Guojibu is the same age as me, born 1993.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You were as well?
I was teaching there. I was in a weird job as a substitute teacher, so I did technically teach in the primary, the middle, and the high school.
I'll have to ask my sister if she had you.
Oh God, who knows? If she's interested in that history there, or if anyone else is, there's a foreign teacher who teaches there who does a year. I think it's a yearly tour of the campus about the history. He's probably reachable somehow online. Anyway, that is probably our most indulgent tangent of the episode. I'm probably just going to ask you like the most key questions, the self-promo questions. So first of all, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. And here's a chance for you to do a little bit of self-promo. But first, before we do that, is there anything about Stories of the Sahara that we haven't touched on that you'd like to, or that you think we really should?
No, I think this has been a very wonderful and thorough conversation. So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thanks for coming on, because I'm pretty sure this is like the best case we've done of like a book that's newly out, a book hot off the presses, so to speak. I can't think of any episode where that has kind of been as striking the iron as it's hot as this one. So it's an exciting one, as well as having yourself a really cool guest, and with us in spirit in a way, Sanmao, a really cool writer. So yeah, thank you too. And I'm glad that we've touched all the bases or areas or whatever that you wanted to touch. So yeah, is there any of your work listeners who are really taken with you can check out, or other output or platforms where they can follow you, or whatever, anything you'd like to promote?
Certainly, yeah. So I am a co-editor at the Shanghai Literary Review, which is an independent literary journal that was founded in 2017. And we're an English language journal for artwork and writing from all over the world. In spite of its name, we're not China focused or Shanghai centric at all. So I would invite the listeners to search for us online and check out our website. We post entries on our blog, but the journal itself is a physical magazine that's published once a year. It used to be twice a year, but we've had to slow things down a little bit late. And I oversee the translation section. So I work with the people who submit their translated works from various languages into English for publication in the journal. If that's something that sounds of interest to you, please, by all means, look us up and submit your work. I'd love to work with more translators.
I have one of the issues sitting on my shelf, although I'm really bad. I have a bit of a tendency to buy literary magazines and journals and then never get around to reading them. But
ask them, yes.
Yeah, it's terrible. But yeah, to surprise you with another wee connection, I'm not in any of the journals, but I did read once or twice, maybe just once. I read at one of the Shanghai Literary Review's open mics in Shanghai. Speaking of like promo, do you know if they still do those? Their Shanghai open mics.
You mentioned that. Yes, we definitely do. So I'm based in New York, but most of our editorial colleagues are in China and indeed in Shanghai. We have a WeChat group that is quite active, and in Shanghai, we run events fairly regularly, once every couple of months, either open mics, readings, or collaborations with others like the Illustrators Collective, Shaving in the Dark, or Spittoons, the musical group from Beijing. So it's a very active community. It's not, contrary to what one might think, it's not entirely made up of expatriates, although fairly well represented. There are a lot of local Chinese folks too with literary, musical, artistic inclinations who join in. So I think it's a really great community platform all around. I wish I were able to be part of it more often. Here in New York, I've organized a couple of events over the years, but those are really few and far between.
Yeah. We do have a few listeners in Shanghai who might be interested. I'm sure if you guys just search for like Shanghai Literary Review, TSLR, you should be able to find them and their WeChat group chat. If you really can't. I'll put my WeChat ID in the show notes. You guys can add that, and I think I'm still in that group chat. I can add you guys, but that's probably an unnecessary step. But in any case, I'll be there if there's no other way in. That's probably all the all the promo that we can force on the listeners without them throwing their phones away in rage. So on that note, again, thanks so much for being on the show, Mike. Thanks for tolerating my ramblings into Philip K. Dick and Mr. Robot. That's where my head's at.
It's been a pleasure. I know this has been wonderful. Thanks for listening, everyone, and hope you get to check out the book sometime.
Yeah, it's a great book. I've got the hardback edition. It's just, as well as being a good read, it is a lovely physical book to have on your bookshelf. But yeah, I'll probably say goodbye to you. Well, I'll end the recording now.
Well, I know that at the end of that call you heard me thank Mike a lot, but I just want to thank him again for being such a fantastic guest. That was really a great chat we had, and I'm sure all you listeners would agree with me on that point. So now we're going to do the plugs before I say goodbye. So let's go over the Shanghai Literary Review again, TSLR. So if you're looking for them on WeChat, I believe their official account's username is just the Shanghai Literary Review. And what I'll do to help you guys, if you want to join their WeChat group, being WeChat, you can get in by scanning a QR code. So I will take their QR code and I'll put it on my Instagram and my Twitter for you guys. And also I'll put my own WeChat ID up in the show notes. So if you want to me to put you in touch with them or invite you to their group via that's one way to do it. Also, I'd like to be WeChat friends, definitely. So that's the first plug. Next plug, this one's really cool. It's the TrChFic map. So I've been making a custom Google map which has all the locations of our authors covered on the show, their hometowns, and the settings of the books. Where a book has a setting on Earth, I have charted that setting on the map. I've also put some other kind of wee bonus locations, and there's one I'm going to add today that I've forgotten to add. It's the location of the Fengjicai Institute in Tianjin that I talked about in the Fengjicai episode. So you can find that in the show notes. I'll put a handy link. There's also, I have it embedded on a page on my own site, dustsymbols.tumblr.com/ I believe, what is it? The map, I've actually forgotten the URL and I can't be bothered looking it up. But suffice to say, if you look in the show notes, you will find links to this map, and it is a cool thing. And if you have any ideas for locations I could add to it, just zap me a message. Speaking of zapping me a message, let's talk about ways you can get in touch with myself or other fans of the show. So I have an Instagram account for the show. It's at TrChFic, TrChFic, and Instagram has launched a pretty cool function where you can make group chats. So I did this for the Sanmao episode, as you heard me mention with Mike Fu. I had 3 other fans of Sanmao in the group with me, who are obviously fans of the show. Among them was a former show guest, Dylan Levi King. So I've made a new group chat for kind of an upcoming episode. I have an episode upcoming, it should be the next one, with Ken Leo, the translator of Chinese sci-fi, basically, talking about Hao Jingfang, that's Folding Beijing author, her upcoming book. So the group chat I've made is a little bit more holistic. It's a Chinese sci-fi group chat, and you can get onto that via Instagram, basically. There is a moment up right now that has like a link to join the group chat, but I'm pretty sure if you follow it, I should be able to invite you or add you. Anyway, we'll work it out. Of course, I also have a Twitter you can follow. Its handle is Angus Likes Words, and I tweet mostly it's tweets about the show and show news or things related to translated Chinese fiction. Sometimes it's just my random thoughts. I try not to be a Twitter ranting or Twitter moral posturing person, but sometimes I do that too. Another wee plug. This should probably have been in the news, but I didn't want to overload the news and front load the show. It's just about the 2020 London Book Fair. I'm going to be there along with the publisher Elaine Charles Asia, helping them out. So expect to hear a wee bit more about that, and if you're going to the London Book Fair, come meet me. I'm sure it'll be possible somehow. Okay, next thing to plug, this one is about money. If you would like to financially support the show to help pay the hosting fees or to, just encourage me to grind a bit harder, there's 2 places you can materially support the show. One is the show's Patreon, patreon.com/TrChFic. That's of course I've forgotten how to spell TrChFic. TrChFic, that's it. And there is bonus content up there. There's a few hours worth of it now, all audio, and one Word document of my show notes. I'm going to try and keep adding to that, although I am a busy individual. If you want to give a one-off donation, there's buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/TrChFic. All the links, well, both of those links will be in the show notes. But of course, in my opinion, the best thing you can do to support the show is it's not about money. It's about spreading the word. It's about reaching potential listeners, getting people to enjoy this show, leading them in this direction, spreading the word. I've repeated myself a few times, so I'll just go through the usual mantra. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your pet dog, tell your Spanish husband, tell your local colonial comandante, and most importantly, tell the warm circle of desert-dwelling buddies with whom you enjoy eating hunks of warm, roasted camel flesh, because that's what Sanmao would want you to do, I think anyway. So until the next episode, 再见。再见，我太楼亚克。